In a world where every struggle feels like an uphill battle, Davey's act of kindness stands out. One rainy afternoon, he shares his lunch with an elderly man suffering from Alzheimer's, sitting in silence, bound by their shared loneliness. The next day, a luxury car stops at his door, the same man inside, now offering more than just gratitude. But the story doesn't end there. What starts as a simple gesture turns into a life-changing moment. Could this be the turning point Davey and his family have been waiting for? But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. The air was thick with the scent of rain as Davey trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his worn-out shoes tapping a rhythm of quiet desperation. Each step carried a weight far heavier than the gravel beneath his feet. His mother had been working tirelessly, taking on odd jobs to patch together what little they had left. Yet the bills on the kitchen table seemed to multiply faster than she could manage. Davey's fingers tightened around the strap of his school bag as he walked, the ache in his chest growing stronger with every thought of his family's struggle. At school, he tried to focus, but the hum of the fluorescent lights only reminded him of the murmur of worry that never left his mind. In the classroom, he stared out the window, watching the world bustle on while he felt frozen in place. The lunch bell rang, pulling him back to reality. His stomach growled, the hunger gnawing at him. With the little change he had, he grabbed a sandwich from the vending machine before he arrived at the food court, but not enough to ease the gnawing anxiety inside him. Walking home, his thoughts were a whirlwind. His mother's tear-streaked face flashed in his mind, how she would sit at the kitchen table late into the night, surrounded by the pile of unpaid bills, trying to make sense of a mountain that never seemed to shrink. Davey promised himself, with a quiet but fierce resolve, that he would help her, no matter what it took. Even if it meant long hours at the garage after school, he'd do it. He would find a way to fix it. He had to. I will help her somehow, even if it means more hours at the garage after school, he whispered to himself, the words falling heavy in the quiet of his walk. His thoughts turned to the evening before, when his mother had hugged him close, hiding her tears with a weak smile, telling him everything would be okay. But Davey knew better. Nothing felt okay. Not when they had no money. Not when everything they had was slowly crumbling. Suddenly, his feet slowed as he reached the park, his shortcut home. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the play area, where the laughter of children seemed to mock the silence that surrounded his own life. He noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench, alone. His hair was a patchwork of white and gray, his clothes shabby, his gaze distant and lost. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the edges of his coat, and for a moment, Davey hesitated. But then something in the man's lonely eyes tugged at him. Davey's heart lurched. He knew that look. It was the same emptiness he'd seen in his mother's eyes, when no one could see the weight she carried, the burden that pressed down on her soul. He approached cautiously, a gentle voice breaking the silence. "Do you need something to eat?" Davey asked, his words almost too soft, like he was afraid to disturb the man's quiet world. The elderly man's eyes flickered with confusion, then softened, as if the gesture was something he hadn't expected but desperately needed. Slowly, he nodded, the motion stiff. Davey unwrapped his sandwich and handed it over, watching as the man took it with trembling hands. They sat together on the park bench, eating in silence. Davey's stomach growled louder than usual, but he didn't care. This moment, however small, was better than any meal he could have had alone. It was a strange kind of comfort, sitting with someone who shared the silence of life's hardships. But just as the man took a bite, a voice broke through the quiet. A man in a crisp suit approached with hurried steps, his eyes scanning the park as if he were searching for something. Or someone?" "There you are," the man said, his voice filled with both relief and frustration. His eyes landed on Davey, narrowing slightly as he assessed the situation. "Thank you for helping my father," he added, offering a stiff but sincere smile. There was something guarded in his tone, but gratitude outweighed it. The old man looked up, his face lighting up as if hearing a familiar voice had sparked some forgotten memory. The man in the suit gently took the elderly man's hand, guiding him to his feet with a tenderness that belied his stern exterior. Davey watched the exchange, suddenly feeling out of place. The sandwich, the park bench, it all seemed so insignificant now, swallowed up by the sudden shift in the air. "I've been looking for him for hours," the man continued, a trace of worry in his voice as he addressed Davey. "He has Alzheimer's, you know. He tends to wander off." Davey nodded, not sure what to say. The situation felt surreal. Here he was, sitting next to a stranger, sharing lunch with a man who had no idea who he was, and now his simple act of kindness had turned into something much larger. The man in the suit turned his gaze back to Davey, his expression softening slightly. "I can't thank you enough for looking out for him." He paused, as though considering something. Then, with a barely perceptible sigh, he added, "Take care of yourself, kid." With that, he gently helped the elderly man to his feet, guiding him away. Davey remained on the bench, the weight of the moment sinking in. He stared at the empty space beside him, the sandwich wrappers crumpled in his hands as if they had somehow been transformed into something more than just remnants of lunch. As they walked away, Davey realized something strange. That moment, brief and simple, had left a lasting impression on him. It wasn't just about the sandwich or the park bench. It was about the connection, the humanity that lay beneath the surface. The old man had needed help, and Davey had given it, not for any reward, but because it was the right thing to do. But there was more. In the man's words, "Take care of yourself, kid," Davey heard a deeper message, a message that life was fragile, that small acts could make a difference, that sometimes helping someone else was the only way to make sense of his own struggles. He didn't know it then, but that moment in the park would set him on a path he had never expected, a path filled with challenges, yes, but also with the possibility of redemption, for himself, for his mother, and for everyone who had ever struggled in silence. And for the first time in a long while, Davey felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe, just maybe, he could be part of the solution. The day after Davey helped the man in the park, the mocking continued. At school, he was once again the target of the rich boy's taunts. The boy, who always seemed to find new ways to make Davey feel small, was waiting for him by the lockers during break. Davey had already endured so many insults, but today something about the boy's jeering felt different. "Nice shoes," the rich boy sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Davey clenched his fists, trying not to react. His worn-out shoes were all he could afford, but the rich boy didn't care. It wasn't just about the shoes. It was about everything Davey lacked. "Just leave me alone," Davey muttered, walking quickly away, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter of the rich boy echoed behind him, but Davey focused on the hum of the school bell signaling the end of break. He would not let the boy's words break him today. After school, Davey walked home, his mind still stuck on the cruel words. His thoughts shifted, though, as he saw his mother working hard at the garage. She had been doing her best to make ends meet, always toiling away late into the night. Davey knew he had to keep helping her, just like he had promised when his father passed away. The weight of their life hung heavily on his shoulders, but he didn't mind. He loved his mother and would do anything to make her life easier. That evening, he worked late at the garage with his mother. the sounds of tools clanging and the smell of oil filling the air. They repaired an old car that had been dropped off earlier that day, a small but steady source of income. His mother smiled when she saw him handling the tools with such focus. She was proud of him, though she wished he could have a normal childhood free from worries. Later that night, as they were wrapping up, something unexpected happened. A sleek, shiny car appeared in front of their house, its headlights cutting through the dim evening light. Davey froze in place, his heart racing. He recognized the car from a distance. It was the kind of car that belonged to someone rich, someone who lived a life he could only dream of. His mother was equally surprised, but before she could speak, the door of the car opened and out stepped the man in the suit, the same man Davey had helped earlier in the park. The man smiled warmly, walking toward Davey with a look of gratitude in his eyes. Davey's first instinct was to hide, to retreat back inside where he felt safe, but he held his ground. The man approached slowly, as if not wanting to startle him. "I came to thank you again," the man said, his voice calm and sincere. "You really helped my father that day." Davey was speechless. He hadn't expected anything in return, and the sudden appearance of the man made him feel both confused and nervous. "You really don't have to do anything," Davey replied, his voice a little shaky. I just did what anyone would do." The man chuckled softly. "Not everyone would have done that. What you did for my father means more than you know. I want to help your family." Davey looked at the man, still unsure of what to say. Was he dreaming? This wasn't the kind of thing that happened to people like him. But somehow, the man's sincerity made him feel like it was possible. The man continued, his tone warm and inviting. "I know this may seem sudden, but I have some resources that might help you and your mother. Perhaps we can discuss it further over dinner sometime soon?" Davey was taken aback by the offer. He looked at his mother, who was standing quietly behind him, her expression one of cautious curiosity. She was just as unsure as Davey, but there was something in the man's eyes that seemed genuine. "Thank you," Davey said finally, a little more confidently. "But I'm not sure if we're ready for that. It's a lot to think about." The man nodded, understanding. "I understand. Take your time, but just know that I'm here if you need anything." With that, the man turned and headed back to his car. As he drove away, Davey stood there, stunned. His thoughts raced. Was this really happening? He had never been offered something so generous before, especially not by someone like him. Davey returned to the garage, his mind full of questions. His mother joined him a few minutes later, her steps slow as she too tried to process what had just happened. They exchanged glances, neither of them quite knowing what to make of the encounter. "Do you think we should take him up on the offer?" Davey asked quietly. His mother hesitated, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't know, Davey. It's a big decision, but he seems sincere, doesn't he?" "Yeah," Davey said, "he does." As they stood there in the dim light of the garage, they both realized that life was changing in ways they couldn't yet understand. But whatever happened next, Davey knew one thing for certain. He had a choice now. He wasn't alone in this anymore. It was a bright afternoon when Davey's life, the small, quiet life he had grown accustomed to, seemed to tilt on its axis. The park had emptied out, and the once bustling streets outside were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a car in the distance. Davey was still sitting on the bench, his mind spinning, trying to digest everything that had just happened. He looked at the empty sandwich wrapper in his hands, then glanced at the man in the suit who was now walking toward him again, his face unreadable but thoughtful. He hadn't expected the day to unfold like this, not in a million years. The elderly man had gone, escorted by his son, and everything had returned to its usual rhythm, but the encounter with the old man and the man's quiet gratitude had stayed with him. It was as though something had shifted in the very air. Davey wasn't sure what it meant, but he felt like his life was on the verge of something unexpected. Then, as if by fate, the man in the suit reappeared. This time, he wasn't looking for his father. His gaze was focused on Davey, steady and intent. "You've done more for him than most people would," the man began, standing before Davey with an air of calm authority. There was a lingering gratitude in his voice that made Davey sit up straighter, unsure of what to expect. "I appreciate what you did for my father. It's not something I take lightly." He paused, looking at Davey with a searching expression. "I know it's not much, but I'd like to offer you and your family some help. I can give you some money, enough to cover your expenses." Davey's heart skipped a beat. Money. The word hung in the air between them, both a blessing and a curse. Davey felt his throat tighten, but his pride wouldn't let him speak. It was as if something inside him bristled at the idea of charity. His mother had taught him to never accept handouts, to always earn what they had, no matter how difficult it was. The thought of his mother's face, the way she carried herself with dignity even in the hardest of times, flickered in his mind. He couldn't imagine accepting help that way, not like that. Not from a stranger who didn't know their struggles, who didn't understand the sacrifices they'd made just to keep their heads above water. But the man wasn't finished. As if he could sense Davey's unease, he took a deep breath and said, But if money isn't what you want, then I have another offer for you." Davey looked up, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "I can offer your mother a job," the man continued, his voice steady. "It's not charity, Davey. It's a thank you for looking out for my father. She's a hard worker, and I need someone who can manage things for me. I think she'd be perfect for it." The words hung in the air. A job. It wasn't a handout. It wasn't charity. Davey's pulse quickened. He could see the glint of something in the man's eyes. A genuine offer. Not something meant to make him feel small or indebted. But still, the walls of resistance in his heart began to rise. Just as the silence began to stretch uncomfortably, Davey heard the familiar, reassuring voice of his mother calling out to him from across the park. She had been walking along the path, searching for him, no doubt wondering where he had gotten off to. Davey could see the small frown that marred her brow, the way her eyes always searched for him in the crowd, always ensuring he was okay. The man in the suit turned as she approached, and Davey felt an uncomfortable sense of urgency rise in him. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt the pressure of the moment. And this was more than just an offer, it was a chance. It was a turning point for his family, a chance to finally escape the suffocating grip of financial struggle. When his mother reached them, her eyes flickered between Davey and the man in the suit. She was hesitant, as though she could sense what had happened. But her gaze quickly softened when she saw the sincerity in the man's eyes. The man spoke again, his tone still firm but kind. "Mrs. Calloway, I know you're doing everything you can to make ends meet, but let me make this clear. This isn't a handout. It's a job, a way for you to get back on your feet." Davey's mother, despite the exhaustion that clung to her every word, shook her head gently, a resolute strength in her voice. "We don't take charity," she said, her words firm but not unkind. There was no shame in her refusal, just a quiet, steady pride. And the man didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, understanding in them. There was a flicker of admiration for her resilience. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But I'm not offering charity. This is a job. And your work ethic, I've seen it. I know you're capable of more than just scraping by." His words echoed in the space between them. Davey's mother stood still, her heart beating just a little faster. She had been through so much, and every step had been a struggle. To hear a stranger believe in her like this felt almost too good to be true, but at the same time, the weight of her pride hung heavy. Finally, after a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice quiet but resolute, as if choosing to embrace the offer despite everything. "I will work for it," she said, her words as firm as the hands that had worked tirelessly to keep their family afloat. Davey watched as his mother's resolve softened just a fraction. Her shoulders, which had been carrying the weight of so many years of hardship, seemed to lighten with the promise of this new possibility. This job wasn't just an opportunity for them to survive. It was a chance to build something better. It was a chance to stand tall, to move beyond the constant cycle of struggle. The man in the suit nodded, his expression approving, and without another word, he handed her a business card. "I'll have my assistant reach out to you," he said. "You start whenever you're ready." As the man turned to leave, Davey looked at his mother, his heart swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. For the first time in a long time, he could see the flicker of possibility in her eyes. It was a strange feeling, like they had just crossed an invisible line, one that had kept them in the shadows of fear and uncertainty. Now, for the first time, they had a chance, a real chance. "Thank you," Davey whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother smiled faintly, her eyes tired but bright with the beginnings of something new. "Thank you for believing in us," she replied softly, her voice thick with emotion. The walk back home, the weight of the world, seemed a little lighter. And for the first time in a long time, Davey allowed himself to believe that things could change. It had been a few weeks since that pivotal afternoon at the park, and things were beginning to shift for Davey and his family. The weight of their daily struggles hadn't vanished overnight, but now there was a tangible difference in the air, like a light breaking through the dark clouds that had hovered over their lives for so long. His mother's new job at the office had brought a new rhythm to their home. She worked long hours, but Davey could see the subtle transformation in her demeanor. There was a quiet confidence in her steps now, a hint of relief in her eyes that hadn't been there before. And for Davey, that was everything. To see her smile, genuine and free of worry, was like witnessing the dawn after an endless night. The change wasn't just in his mother. It was in him too. Each day, Davey's steps felt lighter as he walked to the garage after school. Carl, the garage owner, had become something of a mentor to him. His gruff exterior hid a soft spot for hard work and ambition, and he was quick to recognize Davey's relentless determination. On this particular afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the garage, Carl clapped Davey on the shoulder, his large hands firm but encouraging. "You're one of the hardest working kids I've met," Carl said, his voice rich with approval. Davey looked up, a little surprised at the genuine praise in the older man's tone. "Keep your head up. You're going places if you keep this up." Davey's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't the first time Carl had complimented him, but somehow this time felt different. The words didn't just pass through him. They stuck, grounding him with a sense of purpose. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. He nodded gratefully, his voice quiet but filled with newfound confidence. Every turn of the wrench, every scrape of his hand felt excruciating. As the day wound down and the garage began to empty, Davey took a moment to look around. The familiar smell of oil and metal, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the clinking of tools had once felt oppressive, a constant reminder of how hard he had to fight just to keep his head above water. Now, it felt like home. He had found his place. The next day at school, something unexpected happened. He was walking to his locker, lost in thought, when Alex, a boy from his class who had never paid much attention to him before, approached. Davey tensed at first, unsure of what to expect. Alex had been one of the kids who had mocked him in the past, but now there was a different energy about him, a quiet humility in his stance. "I heard about you from Carl," Alex said, his voice uncertain but genuine. "You're a good guy, Davey." The words caught Davey off guard. He blinked, trying to process the shift. Alex had never spoken to him like this before, but there it was, a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that hadn't existed before. "Thanks," Davey replied, his voice tentative but appreciative. It wasn't a long conversation, but it didn't need to be. In that moment, the walls of isolation that had once surrounded him seemed to crumble, piece by piece. He wasn't the quiet kid who hid in the background anymore. He was someone who had earned the respect of those around him, and that realization was more powerful than anything he had ever imagined. As the days passed, Davey began to notice more subtle changes. The mockery from his classmates had faded, replaced by a quiet respect that felt strange but welcome. Even the boys who had once teased him started to back off, and a few, like Alex, even approached him with newfound friendliness. Davey felt the slow but steady shift, like the first blooms of spring pushing through the frozen earth. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to make him believe that things were finally starting to turn around. His mother, too, was changing. She was still working long hours, but now there was a spark in her eyes that Davey hadn't seen before. Her confidence, bolstered by the stability of her new job, had begun to ripple through their home. They ate dinner together more often now, the conversation lighter, filled with laughter and the occasional teasing. The tension that had once consumed their lives seemed to be dissipating, replaced by the warm glow of possibility. One evening, after a particularly long day at the garage, Davey walked home with a lightness in his step that he couldn't quite explain. His mother was already home, sitting at the kitchen table, going over her notes for the next day. When she looked up, her face lit up with a smile that felt like a beacon, something bright and unguarded. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. Davey sat down at the table, tossing his bag to the side. He stretched out his legs, feeling the muscles in his arms and legs ache from a day of hard work, but there was something different now. He didn't mind it. The ache was a reminder of progress, a sign that he was moving forward. "It was good," Davey replied, his voice full of the new confidence he was still getting used to. "Carl said I'm one of the hardest working kids he's met." His mother's smile widened, her eyes filling with pride. "That's because you are, Davey." She reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of both of us." For the first time in a long while, Davey truly believed it. His mother had always been his rock, but now, with her job and her confidence, he felt like they were partners in this fight, not just survivors of it. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his room, Davey reflected on the changes that had begun to take root in his life. It wasn't just the work at the garage or his mother's new job. It was everything. The sense of belonging, the respect from his classmates, the steady beat of hope that had taken over his heart. There were still days when he felt the weight of the world, when the exhaustion of working too hard caught up with him. But now, there was a lightness in the struggle. He wasn't just working to survive anymore. He was working to build something. And for the first time, he could see a future, a real future, just within reach. The days ahead were still uncertain, but Davey knew one thing for sure. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had a place in the world, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged. The sun was setting on another long day, casting a soft orange glow over the small house where Davey and his mother had started to rebuild their lives. The air was filled with the sounds of quiet conversation and laughter, the hum of normalcy settling in like a blanket over their home. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. The weight of the past, though still lingering in the shadows, didn't seem as heavy as it once had. The future, uncertain as it always is, no longer felt like an impossible wall, but more like a road, stretching out before them, full of promise. Davey's mother had found her footing in her new job. Each day, she walked out the door with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before, her shoulders a little straighter, her steps a little firmer. The stress of juggling bills and fear of the unknown had faded into the background, replaced by a quiet sense of security. Davey saw the change in her, the way she held herself, the way she smiled more often, the way her eyes no longer carried the burden of worry so heavily. It was the kind of transformation that couldn't be measured in dollars or hours worked, but in the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting for a chance to shine. And then there was Davey. As the days passed, his confidence continued to grow. He was working harder than ever at the garage, his hands always busy with cars that were more than just a means of survival. They were a symbol of his potential, of the future he could carve for himself with grit and determination. Carl had taken him under his wing, offering him an apprenticeship, a chance to learn, to grow, and to become something more. Davey had once doubted that he could ever be more than the kid from the wrong side of town, but now, with every turn of the wrench and every lesson learned, he could see a future that was his for the taking. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Davey's mother looked across at him, her eyes full of something soft, pride, love, and an unspoken gratitude. She reached across the table, her hand landing on his, warm and reassuring. "We're going to make it, Davey, together," she said, her voice steady but full of hope. Davey smiled back, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel for so long. "I knew you could do it, Ma," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just about the job, it wasn't just about the garage or the new apprenticeship. It was about what they had become together, partners in this life, no longer bound by the shackles of fear and doubt. Later, standing in the dimly lit garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, Davey approached Carl, who was wiping his hands on a rag after a long day's work. "Thanks for everything," Davey said, his voice steady but sincere. "I think this apprenticeship could really help." Carl gave him a slow nod, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've got the drive, Davey. It's all you now." Davey felt the weight of those words sink in, filling him with a sense of purpose that he hadn't known he was capable of. He had a place here, a future to look forward to, and the people he loved by his side. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. He was building. As the evening wore on, Davey found himself alone for a moment, sitting on the steps of the porch, looking out at the darkening sky. He thought about everything that had led him here, the struggles, the pain, the quiet hope that had always simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. Tomorrow was another day, but for the first time, Davey didn't feel like he was facing it alone. He had his mother. He had Carl. He had the strength to move forward, and more importantly, he believed in himself. Tomorrow is another day, Davey thought, a sense of peace settling over him. The future is ours, and it's going to be bright. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with hope, with determination, and with a family that had become stronger than the struggles that once threatened to break them.